Welcome everyone to The Real News. My name is Maximillian Alvarez. I am the editor-in-chief here at The Real News, and it's really great to have you all with us. All right, so deep breath. The 2020 election was 9 days away as of this recording. And, I think many millions of us understandably hoped that, this might be a turning of the page, right? A punctuation mark, a culmination of a very long year and an even longer election season. But of course, we are not fully out of the woods yet. 2020 would never allow such a nice resolution to our collective woes. And, that should have been expected, I think, right? Elections are never the end-all be-all of our country's political struggles. In many ways, as my guest today has often noted, the real work is just beginning. And to be clear, there are still unresolved questions relating to the election itself that will determine what political possibilities are even available moving forward, including the runoff elections in Georgia, where Senate seats will, be the deciding factor on whether or not Georgia Democrats can control the chamber. On top of that, there is this week's announcement from Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger that the state will be conducting a hand audit of presidential election votes. As AP reports, Raffensperger has said that the decision to trigger a hand audit is not related to pressure from Republican colleagues or to Donald Trump's baseless accusations of voter fraud and his administration's refusal to accept the results of the election. So, like I said, there are still many unresolved questions that will determine the meaning and force of this election. And to help us navigate those unresolved questions, I am really excited to welcome Ben Jealous to the program. Ben serves as president of People for the American Way and the People for the American Way Foundation. And he has previously served as the national president of the NAACP, and he was the Democratic candidate for Maryland governor. Ben has decades of experience as a leader, coalition builder, campaigner for social justice, and a seasoned nonprofit executive. Ben, thanks so much for joining us today, man.
Thank you, brother. It's good to be here with you.
So, all right, let's start with the unresolved questions thing, right? Because like what's playing out in Georgia right now, a lot of these questions will not be answered until we have more time, data, and results to actually work with, right? So nevertheless, though, that predictably hasn't stopped mainstream media pundits from drawing a lot of bold and perhaps even irresponsible conclusions from the limited data that we have from last week's election. Just like with the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election, and I'm thinking particularly of the whole white working class narrative that exploded. We saw a media frenzy this past week as outlets rushed to overinterpret exit polls from the election, particularly regarding the Black and Latino votes. And I mean, exit polls from, by and large, and the conclusions that we can draw from them should always have a big asterisk next to them. But that goes double for exit polls in 2020, when so much of the vote came from early and mail-in ballots. And yet, a lot of oxygen has been spent taking exit poll data
and we're about to spend some more, but let's just
get to yeah, here comes some more. So a lot of oxygen, was kind of taking this data and extrapolating from it, these apparent gains that Trump made with Latino voters, particularly in Florida and Texas, and Black voters, particularly Black men. So there's a great conversation that you and I can have about what those dynamics might mean if they in fact are borne out by the data that we're going to be getting in the coming weeks. But before we even get there, right, I think we have to take a step back
and just ask what's going on with all these brothers voting for Trump.
Exactly. So, I wanted to ask from your perspective, from the PFAW's perspective, what's your read on these exit poll-based media narratives about Black and Latino voters and how these narratives are already shifting? And more importantly, could you talk a little bit about how these narratives are kind of a red herring and this is not really the conversation that we need to be having right now?
Sure. I mean, look, there's a lot there. one thing, I think we have to discern between sort of what's remarkable and what's meaningful. It's remarkable that Trump may have got as much as 19% of Black men to vote for him. What's meaningful, as far as his numbers, I mean, most of his votes came from white folks, like overwhelmingly. It's remarkable that Venezuelans and Cubans in South Florida supported Trump in much higher numbers. What's meaningful is that Trump won Florida because of overwhelming amounts of white voters. And so we got to sort of not lose sight of the meaningful just because we want to talk about what's remarkable. My experience, running as a Democrat against a Republican incumbent for governor here in Maryland and really getting to know like Black voters deeply beyond like my community of West Baltimore, where my family's been for 80 years, or in my historic community, or Montgomery County, for example, where my kids go to school, but really throughout the state, it becomes clear that Trump, how I say this, Trump really appeals to kind of three feelings of the American people. One is white supremacy, another is male supremacy, and the third is national supremacy. And there are a fair number of Black men who are willing to look past your white supremacy if you're about male supremacy and national supremacy. Our experience as Black men has taught us there's a lot of racist white people out there who will disappoint you. And so, you can excuse somebody for kind of, if you will, taking it with a bit of a grain of salt. Now, with that said, Trump is the most racist president I've seen. And what you saw was that Black women overwhelmingly voted against him. Black young people, male and female, overwhelmingly voted against him. But in the kind of middle-aged band, that's where you saw that Blacks were more willing to consider voting for Trump. Now, the other thing, some folks would say it really was about the economy, perceptions about the economy. Now, that would hold out for the fact that where Trump's support seemed to peak generationally amongst Black voters of both genders was in the 30 to 44 band. And I've often told folks, look, the activists come from the young and the old, and it's middle-aged folks like myself that you got to watch out for, because we're worried about, paying for the kids' school, or paying for their sports, or paying for the mortgage, or paying for the car note. It's your 30s, 40s, 50s are really about. And what we saw in general is that people who were more concerned about the economy tended towards Trump. People who were more concerned about COVID tended towards Biden. And of course, we're in the midst of a terrible recession, 8% unemployment nationally, 13% in the Black community. That's been accelerated by COVID. So for a lot of folks, all that's intertwined. But I think that the dust settles, what you'll find is that there are some patriarchal brothers out there, and they tended towards Trump. And what you will find was that there were some folks who felt like Trump was better for the economy of all races. But again, what's meaningful is that Trump was disproportionately got the support of white voters. What's remarkable is that at the margins, there's a little bit more Black support, a little bit more brown support. Now, what I would say is this, though. If there's a lesson here for Democrats, it is that we have to market ourselves to every single voter, that we can't take any demographic for granted. And that most importantly, the question should never be so blunt as, are we winning with women? Are we winning with Blacks? Are we winning with the Latinx community? Rather, we should do what Donald Trump appears to have done, which is to say, who's willing to buy what we're selling? And then sell to everybody. One of the interesting things back in August, we at People for the American Way run a program called Latinos Vote since 2012. It's the brainchild of Dolores Huerta, who's very active on our board, even at 90 years old. And in many races, Beto's race, Andrew Gillum's race, we have been the only group running statewide advertising targeting Latinx swing voters, key statewide races. And so it was in a lot of states this year that we were the only ones, for instance, up on Spanish language radio for Biden and Harris. At the end of August, Trump had outspent Biden 10-1 on Spanish-speaking media, 10-1. And Biden never closed that gap, even with groups like us trying to help. That can never happen again. Similarly, we found ourselves having to hurriedly put together an effort to really reach out to young Black folks in the upper Midwest, fearing a possible repeat of 2016, knowing just the thin margin that those states are won or lost by. Democratic Party absolutely has to have a real vision for inspiring the loyalty of young Black folks. Our young people are right on the front lines of the COVID crisis. They're right on the front lines of this whole crisis in our public safety system and police killings. They're right on the front lines of student debt. And we have to really see them as the canary in the coal mine. If we have a compelling vision for uplifting young Black folks and young people of color, it means we will have an uplifting vision for uplifting young people of all colors. And that ultimately is what the Democratic Party should be about. So again, I would focus on what's meaningful, but I would also focus on the lessons that we need to learn. And we can never allow the GOP to outspend us on Spanish language media 10-1 again. And we can never allow for there to be a question that we have the best agenda to uplift young people of color.
Yeah, I mean, that's a staggering kind of statistic. And God, there's so much that I want to ask about there, but I know we only have you for a limited amount of time. But I really love the way that you framed it, right? Like, again, there's only so much that we can extrapolate from exit polls, but as you said, there are very kind of clear long-term lessons that we need to learn from just the bare fact of this race kind of being as close as it was, the dynamics being what it was, the run up to the election, with these kind of gaping holes in Democratic strategy being what they were, right? And there was something that you said that really, like, really caught me in my heart, because it speaks, very much to like my own family's experience, right? My dad, Jesus, is a Mexican immigrant who grew up dirt poor, became a citizen in the 80s, worked his way to the middle class and lost everything in the Great Recession and voted for Trump in 2016, right? And I think that when you were kind of talking about, the ways that Trump or Trumpism, right, may appeal to people like this, particularly when we factor in age, like you said, there are a lot of hard lessons that it does feel like the Democrats have not learned from 2016, right? The hearts and souls of Latinx voters, of Black voters, and of voters of all shades, right? A lot of them do have like kind of more of a complex texture, right, than anything that like playing Despacito like at a rally can pave over, right? And so I guess I just wanted to kind of ask, like, looking forward, like, what do you think really is the kind of drumbeat that Democrats should be marching to, in order to make sure that this kind of, messaging isn't as effective as it might have been this election, particularly with Black and Latinx voters?
We've got to have a vision for really rebuilding and strengthening unions in this country. And we've got to have a vision for really making it easier for entrepreneurs to grow their success and their wealth in this country. Those are really sort of the bookends of the American dream, that your hard work will add up to a better future for your family. And then if you're willing to take a risk, that, well, this is the best place on earth for you to be an entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs and union members historically were the backbone of this party. And yet, as somebody who exists in both those worlds, what I can tell you is that there's a lot of union members who feel taken for granted, like their dues really fuel a lot of Democratic politics, but they're not getting, frankly, the movement keeps getting weaker and weaker and stronger, gets weaker and weaker and smaller, rather than bigger and bigger and stronger and stronger. And there's a lot of entrepreneurs, my friends in tech, I've been a tech investor the last 6 years, who just feel like the Democratic Party never reads the business section. It comes out and gets their money, but doesn't prepare to have a conversation. And then what makes it glaring is when you sit with the entrepreneurs who are union members, right? Who, are 32 BJ and they're working as janitors, but they've got a little catering business and they want to make it a restaurant. And they're looking at a tax code that they feel like punishes young businesses, small businesses trying to break through. So when it comes to the economy, we've got to get back to basics in the Democratic Party. We've got to have a real vision for how we strengthen unions, and we got to have a real vision for how we really support and foster an entrepreneurial class that, if we're honest, exists throughout the country, virtually, certainly in the top 60% of America, there are a lot of entrepreneurs right on the edge of poverty, all the way up. And we do those two things, then we have a lot else going on for us. But I would say that Donald Trump's ascendance really spoke to the need for us to convince people like your father that we're fighting for.
Yeah, no, I think I wholeheartedly agree, and I think that, I would love to kind of talk more about it, but we'll have to have you on again. But like, I think that
Anytime,
you really, hell yeah.
I mean, really, like I love you guys. I love what you do. Anytime.
Thanks,
anytime.
man. Appreciate that. I mean, but you really, I just wanted to underline it in red pen for viewers, right? Because I think that you really made a poignant point that I didn't want to get lost there, right? Is that especially I can say, like, with the kind of very complicated, dynamics of what we call the Latino vote or the Latinx vote, right? I think you're right that, like, Trump's nationalism does actually kind of provide a pathway to a purchase on whiteness and on Americanness that does appeal. Like, I know it appeals because this is how my family in a lot of respects has felt, right? Like, they immigrated to this country or emigrated to this country, and they like are wholeheartedly in support of like being Americans and subscribing to the American dream. And so if you are kind of projecting this like ethno-nationalist narrative that allows, right, non-white people to kind of have a greater purchase on whiteness by saying we immigrated the right way, right, we are, like the actual, American citizens that fit in the us, not the them category, that's an element of Trumpism that's not going to go away even if he does.
No, it's not. And it's something that is inflamed and exacerbated by feelings of economic insecurity, right? I mean, when you think about, when you're honest about what it is to be a man, a lot of what it is to be a man comes down to your ability to provide. And when you feel like the economy is weak and you feel downwardly mobile, and somebody talks in terms of your demographic, whether it's your national demographic, your gender demographic, or your racial demographic, being entitled to a certain type of supremacy, it's a way to kind of shore up your own insecurity, right? I mean, that's why the worst leaders in history have tended to rise in moments of economic depression, right? And so, yeah, I think that that's what some people, they look at Trump and they only see a racist. Some people look at him and they only see somebody who's an out of control sexist. And some people look at him and they only see somebody, who is a nationalist. And the reality is that he's all those things. And there are plenty of voters who may be repelled by one of them, but who are attracted by two. And as they say, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So that's just real. And the best way for us to counter it is to have a real vision for building a stronger economy that lifts all boats.
Hell yeah. So, I do want us to kind of, round out by focusing a bit on Georgia, because I know that's where you've got your attention focused right now. But I was wondering if by way of getting there, we could stop for a second to talk about this recent op-ed that you published in the Baltimore Sun, right, which is titled "President Should Be Picked by Popular Vote." And
a radical idea,
right? So, like, I use this as a bit of a springboard, right, to kind of talk about that question of what we can't extrapolate from exit polls and even raw voting numbers, because you talk about the Voting Rights Act in this op-ed and voter suppression, and I think this has been obviously a big issue for you for a long time, but it's something that like is very much playing out in Georgia right now, right? Like given the chicanery happening in Georgia with the recount and the runoffs, but also given the past chicanery, that kind of set the stage for all of this.
Yeah.
It seems more pressing than ever to ask, like, how much are we even able to formulate like a useful narrative about voting trends in America, particularly Black and Latinx voters, if we don't take voter suppression into account? And how deep do you think our collective national understanding of voter suppression actually goes?
Well, the important thing for all Americans to understand is just one thing about voter suppression, which is that the antidote to massive voter suppression is massive voter turnout. If you only get that, there's my family. My grandmother actually turns 104 today. As soon as I get off here, I actually got to call her. It'll be lunch her time in California, and I'll
Happy
and I'll
birthday,
wish her happy
Grandma.
birthday. Yeah, she's my when she turned about 95, my parents moved her out to California from the East Coast to kind of keep her close, and she's sharp as she can be. Her grandfather was born a slave. He served in the Virginia legislature during Reconstruction. Laws were put in place to suppress the vote. And it was stated at the time that the purpose for those voter suppression measures was to, quote, ensure white supremacy is the law of the land in every county in Virginia. That was the argument made by a man named Senator Glass, the Constitutional Convention in Virginia. And I raise that to say that this evil of voter suppression has been with us for a long time, tends to be pushed when certain elements in the white community are insecure about their ability to maintain supremacy. They were more plain spoken in 1901, 1902 than they are now, but that's what tends to drive it. And what my ancestors understood then, and what I teach young organizers now, is there's really only one way to overcome it, and that's to turn out masses so that you win the election, so that you can change the laws. Now, on this issue of the presidential elections, it's outrageous that most of the times when Democrats win the popular vote, we lose the Electoral College. That's been kind of the last like 40 years of history in a nutshell. And I don't think any American really, if they're honest, thinks that the president should be decided any way different than the governor or the mayor, which is whoever gets the most votes wins. So we just got to push forward with that. Right now, there's a lot of states in the pact. It started here in Maryland, in a multi-state pact, that they will give their votes to whoever wins the national popular vote. It's triggered when there's enough to get to 270. We're at almost 200 now. At People for the American Way, we absolutely believe in one person, one vote, and we'll be pushing a number of states to join that compact this year.
I know this is may come off as like a naive question, but
Sure.
like after reading your op-ed in the Baltimore Sun, I was really thinking about it in earnest, right? And obviously as the editor-in-chief of The Real News, like this is something that I'm obsessed with like all the time. But like if our voting system worked the way that you describe, right, by way of the kind of state-based national popular vote campaign, do you think that our discussion about voter trends, like in Black and brown communities, like would that look different? Like, because I ask because,
Sure.
so much of what we're talking about here, right, so much of that exit poll based narrative has been based on like, voter turnout in very key swing states, which kind of really warped the narrative of like national voter trends. And it was funny because I actually read your article right after reading this one in USA Today that I thought had the most hilarious headline of all, and it was Latinos for Trump, comma, Arizona for Biden shows diversity of Hispanics in the U.S. And like, I actually texted it to my
Wow, there's a lot there.
right.
There's a lot there.
I actually texted it to my family, and I was like, "Oh shit, you guys! They figured out that we're not all the same person."
So,
Yeah.
what I would say, setting that aside, as somebody who spent my life as a kid between West Baltimore and Northern California, there's a lot in that title. But setting that aside, Yes, if we have the national popular vote, look, all of a sudden we'll be talking about Puerto Rican voters in Chicago and who they're backing, not just Florida or Philly. Puerto Rican voters in New York and who they're backing. Right now, there's these massive states, Chicanos in California, who they're backing. Like right now, there's these massive states that are just like off the map. Like it's just like we don't compete there. They're going to be blue. We don't, we'll be talking about black folks in Mississippi, who they're going to support. We don't compete there. It's going to be red. It's only about 17 or 18 states that can go back and forth. That's insane. That's not the way American politics are supposed to work. It sort of amazes me. Again, my grandma's 104. She's a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson's grandmother by Thomas Jefferson's grandmother's other grandchildren. And my dad descends from more Revolutionary War soldiers than any one person Henry Louis Gates Jr. has ever found on the show Finding Your Roots. And so when you come from really old American families, there is something especially offensive about the notion that we still haven't gotten to the place in American history where it is one person, one vote for the US presidency. OMG, WTF, how long is it going to take? And so we just need to do it. There's nothing more outrageously or understatedly American than the notion of one American, one vote, and who becomes our president. And yet it's never been that way, and it needs to be that way now.
So speaking of examples of how we're not there yet, right? Yeah. So before I let you go,
Sure.
I know that you're focusing, a lot of energies, understandably so, on what's happening in Georgia right now, right? Obviously, the kind of runoff Senate elections, as I mentioned earlier in this episode, right? Like they're gonna really determine, I think what is politically viable for the Democrats over the next 4 years. And I guess I wanted to kind of just turn things over to you and ask, there are a couple of really important questions here, right? Like, will pre-general election trends hold for the runoff? And if not, what should Democrats be doing, in these kind of next 2 months, besides avoiding saying anything remotely progressive per Clyburn, Pelosi, and Spanberger? Like, what do you think, how do you think everything that we've been discussing here will factor into what's kind of playing out in Georgia right now? And what do you think people should be paying attention to?
First of all, let's be really clear, we can win Georgia. If you're thinking about sending $1 to Georgia, send it right now. Send it to Warnock, send it to Ossoff, send it to Fair Fight, Stacey Abrams Group, send it to People for the American Way. All of us are fully engaged in Georgia right now. The early money makes a difference. One of the things that's very frustrating about watching all these black candidates come close to winning for Senate and lose is the money doesn't show up till like 2 weeks out. And for this special, we only have, 8 weeks, 9 weeks, 10 weeks. So if you got money to send, please send it right now. The Georgia will decide whether or not Democrats or Republicans control the Senate. You want to fire Mitch McConnell? Got to be focused on Georgia. It's 50-48 right now with Kamala Harris waiting in the wing to make it 51-50. All we got to do is win these 2 states. We get to fire Mitch McConnell. It'd be huge for America. There's something like 600 bills that are dying on Mitch McConnell's desk right now that would, most of them, move our country forward in some pretty powerful ways. And that's what we can do. I never think that it's worth talking about a political priority until it's time. It's people want to talk about, the composition of the U.S. Supreme Court when we're trying to elect the president. Well, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why don't you wait till we, it's a possibility. And so I would just say to folks, first things first, we got to fire Mitch McConnell. If you want any hope of doing anything good in the U.S. Senate in the next 2 years or longer, and the way to do that is Georgia. Raphael Warnock is an incredible candidate. Ossoff would be transformative, no doubt. But taking the man in Martin Luther King's pulpit and making him a senator, I don't think we've ever seen anything more transformative than that. Some things have come close, or even as transformative, but nothing more transformative than that in the history of the U.S. Senate.
So that is Ben Jealous, president of People for the American Way and the People for the American Way Foundation. Ben, this was awesome. Thanks so much for coming on, man, and happy birthday to your grandma.
Thank you, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you all for joining us at the Real News Network. Stay tuned for more.